So, J. Ruud, what lovable book are we talking about today?
Well, Stacey Margaret Jones, I'll give you a hint. The Heresy of the Didactic.
Can't wait to find out. I need another hint.
Yeah, I thought you might. Here's clue number 2. The orangutan did it.
Okay, I still don't know. But before we go on and I humiliate myself completely, welcome to Between the Covers, the podcast where author J. Ruud and myself, author Stacey Margaret Jones, discuss one lovable book from his list of the 100 most lovable novels in the English language.
That's right.
Have I read this book?
Yes. Or at least.
I hate it when you say
it. The question is tricky, but you'll find out why in a minute.
What's the third and final hint, please?
For the love of God, Montresor.
I don't know what it is. Everybody our listener in podcast land is screaming the title to me, but I can't hear you, sadly.
Sadly, no. Okay. This is the complete short stories of Edgar Allan Poe.
Oh.
This being the closest podcast we'll have to Halloween, I figured Poe was an appropriate choice for today.
Awesome. All right. Well, who else loves this book? What lists has it appeared on?
Well, first of all, the reason I said you'd read this book, but it was a tricky question, is because it's the complete stories, and you know, like everybody else, probably read some stories, but not all of them. And the other thing is that this is it's not a book that Poe published in his lifetime. He was never able to publish a complete collection of his stories. Mm-hmm. So over the years since his death, which is, 180 years ago or so, there have been different publications of parts of his work, but there are only a few complete stories that have been published. And I think it's good to get the whole corpus of his short stories to really get an idea of what it's like. But to answer the question about who else loves this book, it actually does appear on the Greatest Books of All Time website that I mentioned before. That is an aggregate of 375 different lists. It comes in as number 73 among all the books in English that are on that list.
All right.
All the novels in English that are on that list. And it's in it's on the Norwegian Book Club list of the...
Are you an honorary ex officio member of the Norwegian Book Club?
I should be.
You should be by now.
But it is on that list. The one complete novel that Poe ever wrote, the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket, is actually on the Guardian's list of the 100 greatest novels in English. But we can, I think, dispense with talking about that because it really isn't as good as his short stories.
Oh, okay.
I think they only put it on that list because they wanted Poe, and that was the only novel they could find.
Well, and he's known obviously for his short stories and his the suspense and the kind of terror, maybe the psychological suspense of his short stories. So what is lovable to you about this book? I mean, why is this book on? Oh no. I was going to ask you about the down and dirty summary, but I don't know how applicable that is because we have how many short stories is in this completest work?
I never thought you'd ask that, so I never counted them. But
do you know how many pages it is, or did you listen to it?
It was an audio book that I listened to. Okay. So, there are a lot of them, many more that you probably haven't heard of than the usual ones. Yeah. There's probably 40 in there.
Okay. All right.
Maybe.
Okay.
842 pages.
Oh, okay. 842 pages.
So it's a commitment.
Yes, it is.
But it would be easy to pick up and put down because it's short stories. So you could read a story, put it aside, read a story, put it aside.
Yeah. In fact, I mean, I could give you a quick summary of some of the stories.
Give me a quick summary of one of the more famous stories.
Well, okay, I'm going to start with maybe not one that you think of immediately. I mean, people in school have usually read like The Telltale Heart or maybe The Mask of the Red Death.
I can envision the book, the elementary school reading book in which I first read Poe, because I can.
It was probably junior high.
Maybe it was. I mean, but I can feel it, the hardcover book. I can see it in there because it was just such a whoa experience compared to everything else.
Yeah, his stories do appeal to young people, although you probably don't want too young a person to be reading these horror stories.
Be careful with your developing brains.
Yeah, but there is that powerful effect that you get at the end, and that's what makes Poe so important. Is not just that he was one of the first great short story writers in English, or that he was one of the great practitioners of the horror story, but also that he was the first serious literary theorist in America.
Well, let's put a pin in that, because you were going to give me a down and dirty summary of one of the stories.
Yeah. But let me give you a reason why I'm going to use that story.
Okay.
Because in his famous review of Nathaniel Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales, he gives a definition and a theory, basically, of what makes for a great short story. And he thought Hawthorne's were the best he'd read. Both American writers from the 19th century that we have talked about, Melville and Poe, go back to Hawthorne as kind of their inspiration. But Poe says that, first of all, the point of greatest importance, he says, is the unity of effect or impression that the story gives. And then he says...
Effect or affect?
Effect.
Okay.
Then he says that all high excitements are necessarily transient.
Mm-hmm.
So for the text to have a strongest effect, the reader should be able to peruse it in a single sitting. No more than 2 hours. And he says that you can't really get that kind of effect from a novel because
it takes so long to read,
and you have these big effects, and then it has to taper off. So only if you can read it as single reading can the reader receive the immense force derivable from totality.
Right.
Says. And he says that not a single word written should be extraneous to the pre-established design.
I wish he could come and talk to my creative writing students.
Well, you
just get him in there.
You could have them read his review of Hawthorne's Twice Told Tales.
Yeah, but obviously, I mean, it's just funny because it's what I say to them all the time.
Yeah.
Everything needs to be working toward the goal of the story.
Yeah.
Otherwise, put it in another story, take it out. So what about this short story?
I think the one that best illustrates that is Cask of Amontillado. I would guess that the most famous of his stories is maybe The Fall of the House of Usher.
I think Telltale Heart, maybe.
Well, that's probably the one that's the earliest one, or the first one that a lot of people read. Fall of the House of Usher is pretty well loved, I guess. But there's a lot of background material at the beginning of that story. So it's not a story that really follows his prescription all that well. But Cask of Amontillado is. You get these two characters, Fortunato and Montresor, in some Italian city during Carnival. It's probably Venice, but he never says that. And the narrator is Montresor, who says that all the many indignities that he'd suffered from Fortunato, he'd tried to hide their effect on him, but this time he's gone too far, basically. And you don't know what has happened exactly. You just know that he's really mad. But he pretends to suck up to Fortunato and says, "Oh, I know you're the best wine expert in the city, and I want you to come down to my wine cellar and just taste this Cask of Amontillado that I bought. And tell me how how excellent it is, or if I've been cheated, So Fortunato says, "Oh yeah, sure," because he's very, conceited and so flattering him.
Right.
So they go down into the cellars under Montresor's house, which go through his family vaults where the dead are buried. So it's pretty spooky. Fortunato has a cough, and it's damp down there. And Montresor says, maybe your health is too bad. Maybe we shouldn't do this. And he said, no, I want to taste that Amontillado. So they get to the place where he's keeping the cask, and it's sort of an inset into the wall. And Fortunato goes in to taste it. And when he's not paying any attention, Montresor handcuffs him to the wall and then begins to build a wall, walling him in.
Oh, okay. All right.
And essentially burying him alive for him to slowly die. And Fortunato keeps saying, "For the love of God, Montresor!"
Oh, I see. That's the clue I missed.
And Montresor says, "Yes, for the love of God." Everything in that, it's a very short story. It's one of his shorter ones.
Oh, okay.
But everything in it focuses on that ending.
Right. Moves the story toward the ending.
Even as they're going through the cellar and the crypts, they go by the coat of arms, the Montresor coat of arms, which is a golden foot crushing a snake. So it's like, I'm going to crush this snake, Fortunato. And the motto is "Nemo me impune lacesset," which essentially means nobody messes with me without getting theirs back. Yeah, basically. Which also happens to be the national motto of Scotland.
Oh, well, I'm Scottish, so there you go. What year did these stories come out?
Late 1830s and 1840s.
Yeah,
because he was writing over a good period of time.
And he was a contemporary of Hawthorne?
Yeah.
And Hawthorne was Franklin Pierce's college roommate, right?
Yeah. I don't know how that's pertinent.
That's how I place them in history. That's how I know. And somebody says Hawthorne, I'm like, oh, I know when this happened. Because anyway, Franklin Pierce, a terrible president, but perhaps one of the best looking, according to historians.
Exactly. And that's important.
So 1830s.
This, I think, was 1841, the Cask of Amontillado.
Right. Pre-Civil War. So what is... what are the kind of prevailing, what's in the zeitgeist at the time that Poe is responding to or interacting with or advancing the conversation of, or?
Poe is really into everything that's popular.
He enjoys enjoyable things.
He enjoys enjoyable things. And Gothic romance had kind of sprung up as a literary genre in the late 18th century. And Gothic horror stories were becoming more popular.
Right.
Frankenstein was written just, 15, 20 years before this. Jane Austen published Northanger Abbey, which is a kind of parody of Gothic romance.
Oh, okay.
So that's one of the things that he's...
So he likes those and he's saying, I'm going to write some myself.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he becomes kind of the classic practitioner of it. In fact, H.P. Lovecraft, who's probably the most famous other horror writer, called Poe his god of fiction.
So where is this in the kind of history of the short story, so to speak? I mean, short stories are something we just accept as a literary form now. Alice Munro. Of course, I studied Denison and read a lot of Isaac Denison Gothic short stories, which is from the early 20th century. But were they, they were ubiquitous, popular, or did Poe help popularize them?
Poe helped popularize them. They really started to get popular, I think, when periodicals started to become popular, because having couldn't put a whole novel
Right.
in there. And a lot of novels were serialized in periodicals, but Poe wrote his stories basically to be printed in magazines.
And read in totality in one sitting.
In one sitting.
Okay.
And Hawthorne was kind of an early practitioner of the short story. This is the time when short stories are becoming more and more popular. You don't get a lot of, Henry Fielding's not going to write a short story, probably. Not because he didn't that I know of.
Just for our listeners, he wrote long novels.
Very long
novels.
So short stories are becoming popular. So again, something Poe has in mind. Being buried alive was in the popular imagination. It was kind of, for some reason in the 19th century, people began to worry about being buried alive. And there were a few incidents that had come out where you later found out someone had been buried alive. And so Poe, well, in fact, didn't you tell me that George Washington?
I was just going to say, I can't remember who the biographer was, but in the biography I read of George Washington in my presidential biographies project, the biographer said that he was worried about being buried alive, and he wanted to lie in state for at least 3 or 4 days because he wanted people to make sure that he was dead. Yeah.
And he also thought that the whole story of Jesus' resurrection was that he had been buried alive.
Yeah, he was a deist, so he thought that perhaps that's how Christ rose again, was because he had actually been buried alive.
Yeah. So it was in the air from the late 18th century into the 19th century. And Poe writes a lot of stories about people being buried alive.
Because it was in the popular
imagination. He has one story called The Premature Burial. Guess what that's about? Fall of the House of Usher, the sister is buried alive, and the brother comes to realize that, and then she's actually comes out of the grave. And
So why is this book lovable? Why is this book on your list? Because your list is not good for you books. Your list is books you're going to love reading.
Yeah.
We can still quibble about Moby Dick, but in terms of Poe,
if you haven't read it, you can't quibble.
I know, you're right. Someday.
Poe's, his stories just, people like them.
Right.
And they like them because most of them are horror stories.
Right.
But it's interesting when Poe talked about the unity of effect, he lists terror, passion, horror, or a multitude of such other points as possible effects. So he separates terror and horror.
Well, I have heard your friend Chuck Bain, who talks about horror movies, also separates them. Terror is more of the psychological effect of fearing the bad thing that's going to happen. And I think the horror is maybe the display of the bad thing. So that the terror is the fear of what could happen.
Yeah.
And the suspense. Right?
Yeah, I think suspense is.
So I think I don't think he's the only one that sees a difference between terror and horror.
But another thing about horror is that I think horror involves dread and loathing.
Oh, so maybe I'm mixing those up.
Well, I don't know about that.
Yeah.
But just the thought of being buried alive is something that is horrifying. If there's a couple of kind of cliches. You can be frozen with fear, but you recoil in horror.
Oh.
So
one is flight, the other is...
The one terrifies you, the other makes you disgusted. Kind of,
also. Okay.
Or horrified at the thought.
Right. That's interesting. But this also goes toward what we... if you listen to podcasts, even if you don't listen to true crime podcasts, you're going to be offered true crime podcasts, right? Because true crime is a common, popular, let's say, subject matter of podcasts. And I think that's because there is the terror, right? Like, I'm afraid of this, so I'm going to walk right up to it, right? Which is kind of what he's doing. He's using fictional stories, but people were afraid of being buried alive.
Yeah.
So he's saying, okay, we're all afraid of this. I'm going to fictionalize this and I'm going to walk you right up to it. Do you see? Yeah, I think there's a relationship in terms of
So it's cathartic.
Yeah, maybe. Maybe it's a way to experience the thing we're afraid of without experiencing the thing we're afraid of.
Yeah.
So I think that maybe, Poe is just the first true crime content creator. Not the first, but he's participating in the human experience or the human craving for things that we don't want. Turning toward the thing we want to turn away from.
Yeah. So there's also this relationship to true crime also reminds me of your novel, Mr. Catherine. I mean, there's some Poe influence on Mr. Catherine.
Yeah, I would say indirectly. I think I was more influenced by maybe Denison's Gothic. It has a Gothic element because it has kind of unexplained character that comes from the character's mind, right? The shadows, the Jungian shadow of his mind. So is that terror or is that horror? Well, what would Poe say?
That's what I'm asking you.
Well, I think of it as terror because to me, horror is the gruesomeness, and the book has none of that. It's really the suspense, the psychological suspense, and the narrator recreating things in his mind to make sense of what's happened.
Everything we're talking about has to do with the effect that the story has on the reader.
Right.
And not the lesson that you learn from the story or anything.
Right. It's not didactic.
Yeah. And Poe was criticized for writing tales that had no moral. There's no morality in the tale. And Poe said,
I don't care.
I don't care. That's not what this is for. That's not what literature should do. And he criticized Longfellow, who's like during the time he was writing, is like the figure in American literature that most people looked up to as the great writer of the time. And Poe said that Longfellow displayed the heresy of the didactic, which was my first clue, you may remember. It's a heresy.
For our listener, I just did an eye roll that actually hurt my head.
But it's a heresy to true literature.
Yes.
To believe that you have to have a moral.
Well, it is something I struggle with students too, because student writing, I think developing writers are like, this is what this means, or this is what I learned from this and you should too. And it's like, that's not fun to read. I mean, I'll take my own lesson away from it. Thank you.
Yeah.
That's interesting because all of this has also made me think of Isaac Denison, Gothic short stories. And I would say there is some, I wouldn't say it's that heavy-handed, but she's got a learning objective for the reader, I would say.
Yeah. And Poe knew that what Longfellow was doing was kind of related to 18th century poetry. Pope talked about what oft was thought but ne'er so well expressed. That's what poetry did. It took things that you should know and put them in a way that you'd an artful way that you'd remember, kind of. But Poe's more in line with the Romantic poets who aim at giving you an emotional reaction and who glorify the imagination rather than reason.
And this is early Victorian, right? Period.
It's really late Romantic.
Okay,
I'd call it.
All right, because the didactic aspect feels Victorian, like this is how we're supposed to live.
Yeah,
get in line.
There is some of that.
Yeah.
Also, what's characteristic of the Victorian period or the late 19th century, probably anywhere in Western literature, is realism.
Right.
Becomes the important thing, or even naturalism.
Right.
One of the writers that Poe was most influential on was Baudelaire, who's the first of the French symbolist poets who kind of rebel against that realist ethic and look back at the sorts of things that Poe was stressing. So Poe's really more influential on European writers through Baudelaire, and also Dostoevsky was really influenced by him. Actually, Borges.
Yeah.
It's not European, but there are fewer American writers that looked at Poe as a kind of model than there are European writers, especially French.
Well, what this also makes me think is that Poe was writing enjoyable things.
Yeah.
And yet he made a big literary impact.
Yeah.
And I really like that. Like he also was writing the things he wanted to read.
Yeah.
And that's another thing I tell my students, write the story you want to read.
Yeah. And that he knew other people wanted to read.
Yeah.
But we've talked about his horror stories, but people don't usually think of him in other lights, but he did write other kinds of stories, which is why I think the complete stories is a good thing. Because, for instance, one of his favorite things was writing stories of what he called ratiocination, which is just, to the play on, or it's an expansion of the word rational.
Oh, okay.
It's stories that have to do with figuring things out in a logical way.
Uh-huh.
So that's why he invented the detective story.
Oh.
See, Auguste Dupin is his detective who lives in Paris, and the stories about him are written by his friend. You can see Sherlock Holmes all over this.
Sounds like a Merlin mystery written by my husband, Jay Ruud.
That's true, too. But Murders in the Rue Morgue, which is the first and most famous of those stories. The police can't figure anything out. And by the way, speaking of things being topical, Poe's writing that story at a time when England had created its first professional police department.
Right.
And also police departments were beginning to rely on scientific methods to solve crimes.
Right.
So he's right in that.
Right.
The thick of that when he writes this story.
That's cool.
And it's a story that the police can't figure out, but Dupin figures it out, of course. Is the kind of like Sherlock Holmes, a kind of amateur detective.
Sure.
And the big clue is, well, this mother and a daughter have been killed. The daughter is shoved up the chimney. So, I mean, it seems like something really violent has happened. And the only clues are people heard a person talking, or two people talking, and one was speaking French, but the other was speaking a different language. And the people, the witnesses who heard this stuff from outside all claim that it was a different language. like one person says, I think the other voice was speaking English, but it was somebody who doesn't speak English. And then somebody who did speak English says, no, I think it was Russian. And then they go to a Russian guy who was a witness and says, no, it wasn't Russian. I think it was Spanish. And then they go to a Spanish guy. Yeah. And nobody can understand what the language was.
Well, why would people not love this book?
Well, people who want a clear-cut theme in their
short stories.
Yeah, probably aren't that great on Poe.
Oh, okay.
There are some of the stories that people would object to for various reasons. One of Poe's most famous short stories, in fact, the story that he was most popularly known by in his own lifetime, is a story called The Gold Bug. And there are some even though that was his most popular story, you don't see it in all of the collections. And that's partly because there is a black character in the story named Jupiter, who is depicted in a kind of stereotype way as almost like a minstrel show figure.
Yeah.
And the N word is used, although only by him.
Well, but actually by Poe.
Well, yeah, that's a reason why I think some people have not liked or included that story. But it's, when you think about Poe, and this is 20 years before the Civil War, and Poe was raised in Virginia, it would be a surprise if he didn't depict a black person that way. Yeah,
but it doesn't mean that you are going to want to read it as
it doesn't.
Something or to share it with young people or anything like that.
No. But there are some interesting aspects of the character of Jupiter in that he's not a slave and he basically can do what he wants. There's even one point when he does serve. He's sort of the butler or handyman for the guy whose friend is telling the story. But at one point, he threatens to beat him. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there are things that you would not ever expect a Southerner to put in a story that are there.
Right.
So anyway, but the focus of the story is on the figuring out of a code.
Oh, okay.
Cryptography was really popular at the time. And Poe took out an ad in one of the weekly journals challenging anybody to send him a code that he couldn't break.
Oh, wow.
And so he got all these people sending these codes, and he figured all of them out.
Yeah.
And then in the story, which is a story of I can't even pronounce it now.
The rational thing.
Ratiocination. The main character figures out this code and explains how he figured it out. Mm-hmm. And this was, when you figure out the code in the story, you can find this buried treasure. It's Captain Kidd's buried treasure.
Oh, okay.
And Robert Louis Stevenson said that he was inspired by that story to write Treasure Island.
Interesting.
Also, there was a famous American cryptologist named William Friedman who read The Gold Bug and got interested in cryptology. And he ultimately cracked Japan's purple code in the Second World War.
Oh, wow.
So we have Poe to thank for winning the Second World War.
Okay. Well, what ranking are you giving this book?
Well, this is the 15th book we've talked about. And I'm going to put it 15th, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't read it. I did want to say one more thing. About one other story. You don't usually think of Poe as having a sense of humor.
Mm-hmm. Right. It feels heavy.
Yeah. Although the interest in cryptology and solving puzzles kind of suggests a maybe lighter tone, I guess. But he writes some comic stories that are in his collective works. And one of them is called Never Bet the Devil Your Head. And it's subtitled A Moral Story.
Yes.
And it's Poe kind of pushing back on people who criticize him for not having a moral in his story.
Right.
So the moral of the story, I guess, is never bet the devil your head, which leads to Chaos Reader.
Well, I will remember not to bet the devil my head. So I'm still reading the Antarctic expedition history,
which talks about Arthur Gordon Pym, doesn't it?
Not yet. No.
I thought you read to me part of it that mentioned him.
Oh, maybe I did.
Because he, in that story of Poe's, he goes south on a ship.
Okay. Well, he's not a main person in this.
Well,
so.
I know. I just...
Anyway, so I'm still reading that, and I'm reading the poetry edited by Ada Limon. But I have recently read Clue, the script, because I am in this play. But that's
read it many times.
I know much of it by heart, including all of Mrs. White's lines, of course. But it did remind me.
Too bad you're playing Mrs. Peacock. Just kidding.
It did remind me of what it is like to read drama. Because, obviously I've read Shakespeare as an English major and other dramas. But it did remind me of that. And I also am teaching Introduction to Creative Writing, where I had a student write a short script. And it does remind me of the difference in the way a drama is written, right? Just obviously the main thing is dialogue, but there are opportunities in the notes and the scene direction and to direct or guide the production. But I also will say it reminds me that I don't love to read drama. I like to go to plays. I think I find a lot of that kind of takes me out of the experience. You do imagine it as you're reading it, but to me, I prefer fiction. But it is, if there's a play or even I think probably a movie that you like, it's probably could be instructive to read the screenplay or the play. So that's what I have read for Chaos Reader.
All right. I like to read dramas.
I know you do. I knew you would be upset when I told you that.
Not upset, just terribly hurt.
All right. Well, we'd like to remind everybody to just tell one person, one book lover that you know about our podcast. That's a good way to share our podcast. And leave a comment on the podcast on whatever podcast machine you get your podcast on. Did you read the book? Do you like the book? Anything like that. Just share your thoughts with us there. And we will continue to do drawings from the reviews. So go ahead and leave a comment and we will enter you into that. So with that said, we'll see you next week on Between the Covers.